Welcome to the Itihasa channel. The last episode we discussed how Bhimasena conquered the evil Rakshasa Bakasura. And today we discuss the incidents that happened following that in the sleepy little town of Ekachakra. Om Namah Shivaya, Om Nagendraya Namaha, Om Amme Narayana, Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Ganeshaya Namaha, Om Anjanaya Namaha, Om Subramanyaya Namaha. Swami Sharnamayappo, Om Guruve Namaha. So following the killing of Bakasura, the people of Ekachakra were quite happy. When they realized that Bakasura had died, a lot of them had come to the house of the Brahmana to ask him, how is it was your turn to go and go and take the food to Bakasura? What happened? How did he end up being dead? And this Brahmana told them that when he was getting ready to go to the forest to take the food, on the way he met another Brahmana who seemed to come from another realm, and that Brahmana said, let me take the food and go. You go back to your family. And that Brahmana seemed to have occult powers, for he came from a different realm, probably from Devaloka, and he took this cart to meet Bakasura. And that is how he went and killed Bakasura and left that mangled body at the gates of the town. And then they asked him, can you take us to this great Brahmana? And he said, no, I have never met him after that. And the Brahmana said, I know not who he was and where he is now. For when we woke up the next day, we saw the mangled corpse of Bakasura at our city gates, and the Brahmana was nowhere to be seen. And so, singing the praises of this wonderful Brahmana who had rid this torment of Bakasura, the people rejoiced and enjoyed themselves. And they had a festival which was conducted where food was given to all the people around. And Bhimasena and the Pandavas enjoyed for a few more months until one day there came to the town a visiting raconteur, a visiting Brahmin who would travel from city to city telling stories of things in different places. So this was a Brahmana who would go from town to town, city to city, through the day, and this used to be quite common in those days. These people were the social media of those days, of 5,000 to 7,000 years ago. So these itinerant Brahmanas were quite popular with whichever city or town they visited. They would visit city to city, spend their days talking to people around, learning the gossip of the time, going to the courts, talking to people in high places, talking to common people, common folk, finding out things that happened in kingdoms, finding out what happened where, who had whose son, who couldn't have a son and yet had a son, and so many other stories. And then they would go from town to town in the evenings, be received by people with largesse, people around who would want to hear these stories of other towns and their own town. And these people used to be wonderful raconteurs of stories. They could tell wonderful stories, happenings of various places, and they would spend the evenings and acquire the hospitality of the great people of the place, and they would spend their time telling stories to various people. And so into this town came this mendicant Brahmin, who was immediately received by this Brahmana who gave shelter to Kunti and her children. For he was a large-hearted man, and anybody who wanted a place to stay was welcome to stay at the Brahmana's place. And so, having invited this Brahmana to his house, he fed him, he gave him a good meal, and after the meal, when they were all sitting down around the fire, around the campfire, this Brahmana started to tell the stories of various places that he had visited. He started to tell the story of the various Tirtha Sthalas, the places of worship, the various rivers that he had bathed in, the various temples he had visited, and the various priests he had met, and the knowledge he had gained over the years. And there, sitting around this fire, were the 5 Pandava brothers, Kunti, the Brahmana in whose house Kunti stayed, and his wife, and the child dozing in their arms, children dozing in their arms. And this wonderful raconteur enthralled his small audience with all the stories that he had come across through his travels all across the length and breadth of Bharatvarsha. And then, having told about all the wonderful places of worship that he had visited, he started to tell about the great Swayamvara that was going to be conducted in the kingdom of Panchala. And hearing of the Swayamvara, the Pandava brothers sat up in excitement. Whose was the Swayamvara who this Brahmana was talking about with so much fervor? And then the Brahmana started to tell the story of the King Drupada. A lot of the story was already known to the Pandava brothers, for they were part of the story as we had discussed in an earlier episode. But a lot of the context was not known to them, for some things were just told to them in parts, and today they got the entire context of the story of the Panchala kingdom, King Drupada. And so this Brahmana started to tell them the story of the Panchala kingdom and the King Drupada. He told about how King Drupada had an earlier son called Shikandin who was born a woman, and it was rumored that she was born a woman. But there was some Yaksha who then finally made this woman a man. And finally, Shikandin was married off to the daughter of the king of the Dasanakas, Hiranyavarman. And then the King Drupada lived his life in luxury and in peace, had many more children after that. And then finally there came a day when the Kauravas attacked Panchala. And he started to describe how in the initial wave of war, the Kaurava brothers, 100 of them with Karna, and a small contingent of the Kaurava army attacked Panchala and were beaten black back and beaten down black and blue. And deep in their heart, there was a thrill in Yudhishthira's heart, and Bhima, Arjuna, Nakula, and Sahadeva's heart as they heard the story. For it was their story being recounted to them from another perspective, from a perspective of how the stories have traveled through time after this incident had happened. And then the Brahmana started to tell about how the Pandavas attacked Panchala. And it was not the 5 Pandavas, it was just 4 of them who attacked. And the brutal Bhimasena lay waste to the Panchala army, and the wonderful Arjuna on his chariot combated both King Drupada and his trusted commander Satyajit. And single-handedly Arjuna would take down the entire Panchala army. And the great Mahabaratha that Drupada was no match for this brilliant Pandava Arjuna. And Arjuna's heart swelled with pride as this Brahmana started praising Arjuna's prowess and how he captured the Drupada and took him to his guru Dronacharya, who then took away half the kingdom of Panchala, leaving the capital city of Kampilya under Drupada. And then the Brahmana told the story of why this war happened, of why Dronacharya had asked his students to attack Panchala. And this was the part that the Pandavas didn't know of, how at an earlier time Drupada's father, the king Prishata, had asked his friend Bharadwaja to teach Drupada the art of war and the Vedas and Shastras. And Drupada had come to the ashram of Bharadwaja to train, where there was also there training with him was Bharadwaja's son Drona. And the two became thick friends, and Drupada had that time promised half his kingdom to Drona in returns to the notes of the day and some help in studies, and in return for being taught by Drona, as Drupada couldn't understand and remember too much of the texts. And so at one time after that, when Dronacharya wanted money and went to the king of Panchala asking for half his kingdom, Drupada insulted him, for he knew not who this man was and probably forgotten him. And then, seething in anger, Drupada had learnt the various astras from Parshurama and come down to Hastinapur to teach the princes of Hastinapur. And then, as Guru Dakshina, Dronacharya had insisted that they conquer Panchala and bring Drupada to him. And with a gleam in their eyes, they looked at each other, for they knew they were the main protagonists of the story, and they were hearing the story from a third party perspective. And this Brahmana was praising them without having an inkling of the fact that these five handsome young men sitting in front of him were the actual people who had conquered Drupada and brought him back to Dronacharya. Then the Brahmana went on with the story. He told of how Drupada was seething in anger and in humiliation at having been beaten down by his close friend Drupada and was waiting for revenge. But through that battle where he had observed Arjuna fight, the valiant Arjuna fight, he knew that this Arjuna would be the one man who eventually would conquer Drona, the only man in Bharatvarsha who could take on Drona and defeat Drona. And he felt bad and vowed the fact that he didn't have a daughter to marry to Arjuna. And it hurt him deeply that he was not able to have a daughter who could be a worthy wife for the great warrior Arjuna, who would eventually join the Panchala kingdom to take on the Hastinapur kingdom and kill Dronacharya. For there was only one man who could do it, and it hurt him badly that he didn't have a daughter to marry her off to. And so then King Drupada started walking through the forests of Bharatvarsha, searching for great sages who could give him a daughter. And through his travels through the forest and from ashrama to ashrama, he came across a great rishi called Upayaja. And then Drupada started making inquiries about this Upayaja and finding out from the various brahmanas in the ashramas surrounding this ashrama. He realized that there were two brothers, Yaja and Upayaja. They were both Snataka Brahmins. Snataka Brahmins means those who were trained in Vidya, who were trained in Vrata and became Vidya Vrata Snatakas. The type of Brahmins who had completed their studies, had undergone intense Vratas to cleanse their body and cleanse their mind, and had learned the entire Vedas and Shastras and its 6 Angas and everything there was to learn, and they were doing intense penance to clear their mind and make it sharper. And from the people around, he heard that Yaja and Upayaja were able to do intense tapasyas and yagyas that could bring out marvelous results. And so when he came across Upayaja, he went to him, prostrated himself to Upayaja's feet and said, "Let me serve you, O great Rishi. Let me serve you and be of use to you." And Upajaya consented. And then for the next 1 year, Drupada spent his time as a common man, not as a king of a palace, not as a king of the Panchala kingdom, but as a common man, and did everything in the service of Upayaja. And in time, he came into the good books of Upayaja, and at one fine day, when Upayaja was pleased with him and smiled at him and said, "Tell me how I can repay you for all that you've done to me," he looked at Upayaja. And then Drupada introduced himself as the king of the Panchala kingdom, King Drupada. And he looked at Upayaja and said, "I wish to have a child, a son who will kill the great Rishi Dronacharya, for Dronacharya is no ordinary man. He's been given the great astras, including the Brahmastra, by his fathers and various other rishis around him. And he is a formidable warrior and no mean warrior. It's very difficult to kill him. There is one great warrior called Arjuna who could possibly kill him. And I would like a son who would kill Drona and a daughter who would marry Arjuna, and together I'm sure they would be able to tackle Dronacharya." And then with his hands folded, Drupada touched the feet of Upayaja and said, "I request you to do the Putra Kama Yajna for me to be able to get children, worthy children who could beat this great Brahmana, Dronacharya." And Upayaja looked at him and said, "I am not the man for you, for I do not do these yajnas for personal benefit. These yajnas have a higher calling, and where you have to do a great yajna, even if it's a yajna like the Putra Kama Yajna to achieve children, It has to be done for a higher calling, not for defeating one single man. And then in tears, Drupada tried to entice Upayaja. He told him, I will give you 1,000 cows if you do this for me, and I shall give you an ashrama where you will never have anything wanting for the rest of your life. And then Upayaja smiled at him and said, I have an elder brother called Yaja. He and me were both Snataka Brahmanas, had the same training from the same masters, and are equal in our abilities. I suggest you go to him, for he has no concept of what is right and what is wrong. His conscience evades him, and it is quite possible that he will accept your gifts and do your bidding. For one day when we were in the forest once, I saw a fruit fall down from a tree. And my brother Yaja looked at the fruit, picked it up from its unclean surroundings, and without even casting a thought once as to in which surroundings that fruit had lain after it had fallen, he picked it up and wiped it and ate it off. For a man who can pick up a fruit from unclean surroundings and eat it could very well take your gifts from you and do your bidding for you. And there I knew that my elder brother Yaja did not have a conscience or a moral compass, and he would do your bidding and he would take your gifts and do your bidding for you. Go to him, he may help you out. And so saying, Drupada went to the elder brother of Upayaja, who was called Yaja, prostrated himself to Yaja's feet and said, I am King Drupada of the Panchala kingdom. I am desirous of having a child, preferably a male child and a female child. The male child should be strong enough to take on the great Rishi Dronacharya, who is almost like a Brahma Rishi in his strength and abilities. And a female child, if possible, who I can marry off to Arjuna. Together, both of them would take on Dronacharya and kill him, for I am burning in jealousy and burning with revenge. And for this I shall give you 1,000 cows, and I shall set up an ashrama for you where nothing shall be wanting for the rest of your life. And Yaja smiled at the king and said, then so be it, Tathastu, I shall do this Putrakama Yajna for you. And so Yaja came back to the town of Panchala. As he was coming, he told the king Drupada, I wish that you call my brother Upayaja too, for this is a big yajna that we will be performing. It will be difficult for me to perform it all alone, and I'll need his help. Go back and tell him that I have asked him to come and I have summoned him. And so, having been summoned by his elder brother Upayaja, had no other choice but to follow Drupada back to the Panchala kingdom. And there Drupada set up a huge yajna shala where he set up a huge place for a yajna. A yajna stamba was set up, and all the requirements for the yajna were brought by Drupada as instructed by Yaja. Everything was kept in ready, and then finally the yajna began. In the course of the Mahabharata, through the happenings 5 to 7,000 years ago, there were numerous instances of phenomenal capacity, phenomenal episodes and phenomenal instances that we cannot even dream about, that we cannot even imagine. Episodes that if we got a chance to do time travel and probably go back in time to that time to see, there were some episodes that would be worth seeing. One of them was the yajna that would follow. Of course, the Gita Upadesha by Krishna to Arjuna and the Vishwaswarupa that was shown by Krishna to Arjuna would rate among the highest in the things that we would love to observe and love to have been witness to. Among them would also be the 7th day of the Kurukshetra war, where Ghatotkacha fought Duryodhana, and the other parts of the war that followed. A phenomenal day, a blood-curdling day. But a day which would be an honor to have witnessed. And so one such great day, one such great episode that was worth witnessing. And if we would have the possibility of time travel and go back to the time 5 to 7,000 years ago, this one yajna would be something that would be a dream to witness. The great sages, the great rishis, Upayaja and Yaja, sat down at the sacrificial fire, and surrounded by all the things that they had requested Drupada to bring, they started the sacrificial fire. On the side was Drupada's favorite queen who had given birth to Shikandin. She was in attendance and she was asked to be there to partake of the libations that would make her pregnant with the children that Drupada so badly craved. And she was in her own world, enjoying herself, not paying too much attention to this great yajna, what was going on. And as the yajna progressed, Yaja and Upayaja started chanting arcane mantras, mantras of a time gone by when the earth was still in its infancy and the universe too was in its infancy. Mantras that would be spoken in whispers, mantras that would be spoken sometimes in loud voices. And then they started throwing in various herbs into that great sacrificial fire and ghee, clarified butter. And as the flames of the flames of this started to increase in size, they started leaping into the air, hundreds of feet into the air. And as these flames started leaping hundreds of feet into the air, there emerged out of this great sacrificial fire a large pot filled with ghee. A ghee that was frothing and aromatous, which was filled with an aroma that filled the air. And then Yaja took his hand out and took the jar of ghee out of this flame. And then he summoned Drupada's wife and asked her to consume this ghee. But Drupada's wife was busy enjoying the yajna's other entertainment, and then she suddenly realized that she was being called by Yaja. She looked at Yaja and told him that I have just had a lot of sweet and I've had saffron in my mouth and I've not purified myself. Give me some time and I shall go bathe and come and purify myself, and then I shall consume this ghee that will make me pregnant. And then this great Rishi Yaja, who was in the middle of this yajna chanting mantras and taking hold of this great pot with ghee, looked in consternation at this queen of Drupada and said, "It is not possible to wait, woman. Walk away." And then taking this pot of ghee, poured the ghee into the flames. And as he poured this pot of ghee into the flames started leaping higher and higher, hundreds of feet into the air, taking multitude of colors. Various colors started emanating from this flame, and then there was a burst and a huge sharp retort was heard, a sound that echoed for yojnas around. And there from that flame came out a splendid crystal chariot, a crystal chariot borne by the most marvelous of horses. And as the chariot emerged from this great flame, there standing on the chariot was a tall, handsome man, a handsome man of 14 to 15 summers, 14 to 15 years of age, bright in this chariot, resplendent with ornaments that seemed to be of another realm. Ornaments, unearthly ornaments, and an unearthly crown on top of him. And there, smiling, he came out of this flame. He came out and bowed to Yaja and Upayaja, took their blessings and stood on the side. And as the people around gathered there looking at this great yajna, were marveling at this splendid young man, there emerged from that huge flame a woman of extraordinary beauty, dark as the black dark night of Amavasya. She had beautiful long eyes like lotuses, dark blue hair and fair eyebrows. A woman of exceptional beauty. She had a beautiful figure and a deep bosom and curved hips and tall, long, tapered legs. And as she walked out of the sacrificial fire, there were gasps all around seeing her. unbeautiful, unearthly beauty. And then she went and stood next to her brother. And then Upayaja got up and walked away from the Yajnashala, partly in disgust for having been forced by his elder brother to do this great Putra Kama Yajna. And then Yaja started to describe these two people standing in front of him. He told Drupada, "This man standing here in front of you is your son. He shall be called Dhrishtadyumna. And this woman who stands here in front of you is your daughter, and she shall be called Krishna. Krishna, for she is dark." Krishna means dark. Krishna is the name given to the Lord Krishna, for he was dark. Krishna is the name given to Krishna Dvaipayana, for he was dark and born on the Dweep or island on the Yamuna. And so she shall be called Krishna. The Krishna meaning for a woman, whereas Krishna is for a man. And she shall be called Krishna. And then a voice from the heavens ranged out and said, "This man standing in front of you, Dhrishtadyumna, shall be the cause for the death of Drona as you have wished. He shall lead the battle of the ages. He shall lead a Dharma Yuddha. And he shall take on the army where Drona shall be, and he shall be the end of Drona." And this woman here, this beautiful woman, is meant for the most eligible man in all of Bharat Varsha. She will be the end of the Kshatriya race. She will be the end of the entire Kshatriya race in Bharat Varsha. And take these two, Drupada, as your child. And as that voice from the heavens was speaking, Drupada's wife came to Yaja, fell at his feet and told him, "Let these two children know only me as their mother and nobody else. Let these two children regard me as their mother." And Yaja said, "So be it," and muttering a few mantras, he blessed the two standing in front of him, Dhrishtadyumna and Krishna, and walked away. And then as the eyes of Dhrishtadyumna and Krishna fell on their mother, they immediately went and touched her feet and hugged her. And Drupada knew that these were the children that would change the destiny of Panchala. Why, they would change the destiny of Bharat Varsha. And so in deep love for his daughter, he started to call her Draupadi. As the daughter of Drupada, she would henceforth be known as Draupadi or Krishna Draupadi. And she would eventually lead the way to the decimation of the Kshatriyas of Bharat Varsha. And then this Brahmana started describing the beauty of Krishna Draupadi. As he described her beauty, a woman, extreme beauty, who was dark as the night, and the most gorgeous woman of all of Bharat Varsha. It was said that when she would walk, her fragrance would be like the fragrance of blue lotuses and would spread through many yojanas around her, much like Satyavati of yore. It was said that when Krishna Draupadi would walk around the earth, her feet would lightly tread the ground, barely causing it to sink, barely causing the soil to be disturbed. And her beautiful fragrance would spread through many yojanas around her. And it was said that men would swoon looking at her beauty. And it was said that only the greatest prince would marry her. And it was said that Drupada had made the Snataka Brahmana Yaja to bear her for him so that she would marry the great Arjuna. But it was sad that recently the great Arjuna and his 4 brothers and their mother Kunti had perished in a fire caused by the house of lack. And it was said that Drupada had cried copiously as if he had lost his own son. For it was said that there was less sorrow in the kingdom of Hastinapur than in the kingdom of Panchala, when in the kingdom of Kampilya, when Drupada had heard of the death of Arjuna. And he had wanted only Arjuna to marry Draupadi, his wonderful daughter, the daughter who was meant for Arjuna alone. And on hearing of Arjuna's death, the inconsolable Drupada knew that he had to find a worthy man for her for his daughter. And so he had organized a Swayamvara in the kingdom of Panchala in the city of Kampila. A Swayamvara that would be conducted in a few days' time, a Swayamvara of no parallel, a Swayamvara that was beyond parallel. And he had invited all the greatest kings of all of Bharat Varsha to come. And it was said that there was a contraption that was set up and a great bow that was set up, that only the wielder of the great bow and who could send the arrows into that contraption would get the hand of Draupadi in marriage. A yantra or a contraption that was set up. That yantra was said to be so difficult to master that only someone as worthy as Arjuna, who no longer is with us, would be able to target that yantra and would get the hand of Draupadi. And as these Pandava princes and the Brahman of Ekachakra listened with rapt attention, they didn't realize that it was daybreak. For the entire night had passed as they listened with rapt attention to the wonderful story of the birth of Draupadi and Dhrishtadyumna, and how she was meant for the great Pandava Arjuna, but now that the great Pandava was no longer there, he had set up the Swayamvara to get the best suitor in the land who would be equal to Arjuna in every way to marry off this wonderful woman, Draupadi. And yes, in all these serials, we have seen Draupadi as this beautiful, fair princess. But Draupadi was as dark as the night, for in those days, the dark color was the most beautiful. Arjuna himself had the color of ash and was quite dark too. Krishna, the Lord Krishna himself, was as dark as the night. And so it was a dark complexion that was the most sought after, including the handsome Nakula. And so it was almost daybreak. Quite like how people are hooked onto social media of today. They don't realize time passes and it becomes day. So too in those days, these great traveling mendicants that are conters of the time, the suitors of the time, would enthrall their audiences through the night. But luckily for those days, they would not stay in one place too long. For can you imagine an entire town hooked on to stories and reels that happen through the night, losing sleep? Oh, that would be a terror to think about if such a day were to come at some point of time in the future. We hope such a day would never come in the future. And so the Pandava brothers and their mother Kunti retired for the few hours that they could get sleep before they would have to go around asking for alms. But none of them could sleep. And Kunti could feel the electricity in the air. Kunti could feel each of her sons imagining spending the rest of their days with this wonderful woman, Draupadi, Krishna Draupadi. And as they all lay down on the floor, Kunti quietly looked around. The fervent feeling of excitement that was there in that room in everyone's heart. Kunti knew that this was the woman who would be the rightful wife to Arjuna. But she knew that if she was the rightful wife of Arjuna, it would create dissent among the other brothers who longed for her just as much. And there in that room, that cold-hearted Kunti, that calculating, cold-hearted woman Kunti knew that if these brothers were to win over the kingdom of Hastinapur, if these 5 brothers were to win over the kingdom of Hastinapur and conquer their evil cousins, the Kauravas, headed by Duryodhana and aided well by Karna, that this woman Draupadi would have to come into this family. And if she came only to Arjuna, this would create a discord, and she had to come to all 5 of them. And in that instant, that cold, calculating woman Kunti realized that Draupadi would have to marry all 5 of them. It was no accident that Draupadi would have to marry all five of them. When they finally came with Draupadi and Kunti would say, distribute, share the arms with all of you. It was said well knowing that they had not brought arms from the surrounding houses. They had brought Draupadi back from the Swayamvara. For it was very clear in Kunti's mind where her sons had gone that day in the morning. It was obviously not to collect arms. It was for the Swayamvara. And that day when Kunti said, share the arms among all of you, she very well knew what she was saying. It was not done by mistake. And there's a story to why Draupadi would have to marry 5 husbands. We shall discuss that at a later time. And so, taking the name of our gods, we shall continue the story the next time. Om Namah Shivaya, Om Nagendraya Namaha, Om Amme Narayana, Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya, Om Anjaneyaya Namaha, Om Ganeshaya Namaha, Om Kartikaya Namaha, Swami Sharanamayapo, Om Guruve Namaha.